He was one of the most iconic generals of World War II, beloved by his men, feared by his enemies. And his early death has left historians and the public alike wondering how the post-war world might have been different had he lived. But George S. Patton was more than the Hollywood image of later years. Just over 85 years after Patton's death, the National World War II Museum is holding a special symposium on the life and career of this military leader who captivated the American imagination and continues to today. I'm Bradley W. Hart, Senior Historian here at the museum. To give you a special preview of the symposium, I'm joined now by two of my colleagues here at the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy, Executive Director Michael Bell and Senior Historian John Curatola. Thank you to you both for being here.
Glad to be here.
Thanks, Bradley.
Let's talk Patton. Mike, one thing that we've talked about before is that Patton is a multifaceted figure in a lot of ways. In some ways, he's this sort of Hollywood icon of later years. He's iconic in some ways even at the time, but he's a man and a military commander too. How do you reconcile the image of Patton versus the reality?
Yeah, I think it's super fascinating. You find there are so many different Pattons. You have the image that Patton himself tries to create. You have the image that the embedded media with him creates. You have the view of his staff and also his personal staff in particular and how they saw him, even his weaknesses, how some of this was a facade that he'd built. You have other competitors and critics, and then ultimately you have this media, particularly the 1970 film, that creates an image of Patton as well. And then, truth be told, I'm an armored cavalry officer. I mean, we went to school in Patton Hall. You pass the Patton statue every day on the way to class at West Point. And so, there's a influence that we sometimes don't appreciate on things like our doctrine, combined arms doctrine today, that really Patton is the genius for, that sometimes even his hand is kind of hidden. So you got a very public piece, and then other times you have this kind of hidden one. Last one I'd say is, I think as you find on his inner staff, he is much more sensitive, much more introspective than you would imagine from the public image, but that a lot of what he's created is intended to be something motivational for the troops. And as you mentioned, those who served, particularly in the Third Army, really saw themselves as part of Patton's Third Army, something that Patton wasn't pushing. He was Patton, he wanted an identity for Third Army. So I think to explore those different ones and then come to an appreciation about who is this complex character, warts and all, he's an incredibly effective leader.
Patton does seem to have this sort of outsized presence. You mentioned it's Patton's Third Army. You don't see this with many other generals, if any other generals in the Second World War. But let's go back to this.
If I could jump in on that, it's interesting. He's pushing that it's Third Army. Mark Clark in Italy is actually what the reporters will say it's Lieutenant General Mark Clark's Fifth Army, and will actually try to brand it that way. So I think it's interesting to see how here's two kind of co-equal Army commanders are using the media separate. So thanks for letting me jump in.
Absolutely. Let's talk about this doctrinal piece that you mentioned a moment ago. Patton, he's born in 1885 in my home state of California, which a lot of people don't know. His early military experience actually comes in Mexico, but it's World War I that really becomes the formative moment in a lot of ways of the way that Patton approaches the rest of his career, especially involving armor doctrine. I wonder if you can talk us through some of that.
Yeah, I would even back up a tiny bit before. He's commissioned as a cavalry officer. And I think you see, even in the uniform he has in World War II, the aspects of both the armor and the cavalry uniform combined, whether it's his boots and the swagger stick. Your uniform's tight-fitting so it doesn't get caught in the tank. But, he's on the border with Mexico in my old regiment, the 8th Cavalry. And, one of the things we see for the Pershing's intervention into Mexico against Pancho Villa, Patton's regiment's not going to go. And so Patton finds a way that he can get an opportunity to be the aide for Pershing so that he won't be left behind. And so you see this drive to take advantage of circumstances, but also insert yourself, which I think sets him up. Then you see a similar piece in World War I, how he takes advantage of that and goes from headquarters commandant into, battalion commander, tank brigade commander in the same way. So that's my segue on how, first it's cavalry and then it's armor, and then in the interwar period, it's the merging of these branches that I think is pretty incredible.
And of course, he has a personal relationship with Pershing as well.
Oh, he certainly does. I mean, he's going to be the aide, but Pershing leaves for Europe on the Baltic, the passenger liner that takes the AEF staff. He's actually engaged to Patton's sister, and so that's going to languish and doesn't happen. Patton's part of that little small crew that's the nucleus of what becomes the American Army in Europe.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, as Mike brought out, he has a personal relationship with Pershing. One is professional, but then the personal one with his sister. And he's actually able to kind of leverage that relationship to a certain extent for his own personal or professional desires. But by the same token, he's also worried about favoritism and nepotism if that marriage was to happen. And so to Mike's point earlier, and I agree with him, that he's a very aggressive officer who's ambitious, who wants to do great things. And he'll leverage those relationships, I think, to the greatest extent possible without falling into this trap of being seen as a nepotistic kind of an officer itself. But that does get his foot in the door, as Mike pointed out, when it gets down to Mexico with Pancho Villa in the March of 1916. And most people don't realize, but he's actually the first U.S. Army officer to get involved in mechanized warfare, for the U.S. Army, using a vehicle to apprehend Julio Cardenas, who's one of Pancho Villa's lieutenants. And he not only does he kill the guy, he straps him to the hood of the vehicle and he takes him back to the headquarters. And as a token of his appreciation, Pershing allows him to keep Cardenas' saddle and his sword. It's kind of a trophy for this engagement. And so you're already seeing that he's able to leverage these relationships, and of course he gets himself as a member of the AEF staff and basically serves on that staff while he's bored for a while there. But again, he's able to leverage that relationship to put himself in a place to make a difference.
Well, and I think, to jump in there, I think his drive is to distinguish himself. He seems almost self-conscious about his high voice and things like that. And how do I really deliver results? And stand out, and this aspiration to really be the superior officer, I think, is driving him. And then we'll see that turns into a desire to win, as you move into high command. But I think that's interesting. The other one, I think, with the punitive expedition, they also, the first time we're using aircraft.
Yes.
It's mostly as a kind of signal and reconnaissance role. But, you really see the nucleus of these ideas that become pretty formative in a couple of years as World War I cooks off for the Americans.
And I think the point you bring is a good one in the larger aspect here. And when the cusp of the First World War, science and technology is now having a much greater influence on military technology. And the argument's been made that there's more change occurring in the military from 1914 to 1918 than change occurred from 1814 to 1914. And to Mike's point, aviation, long-range artillery, wireless communication, mechanization, armor, all these things are happening in this 4-year period. The genesis of basically every modern military application that we know today starts with the First World War, and Patton's there on the ground floor as we develop what we call today combined arms integration.
I think in some ways we might consider Patton to be what we would call today an early adopter of a lot of this technology. He's thinking about this. He's using these technologies in new ways. The Pancho Villa example is a really interesting one there. Let's talk about the 1930s, when a lot of this technology is really being thought about in a fundamental way. Of course, during World War I, technology is being developed, but it's in the 20s and 30s that we start to see the intellectual sort of conversations about this. What's Patton's role in these conversations in sort of the interwar period?
Yeah, and even some of it sneaks back in World War I. He's looking at the French Renault tank that they have and trying to figure out, how can I put a whip antenna for a radio and a coaxial mounted machine gun so that where the main gun points I can shoot machine gun with the sight. They're not able to pull it off, but he's really thinking about changing the technology. In addition, the radios didn't receive it quite as well as he'd hoped, but you're experimenting with mechanization, combined arms, communications. When he's at the War College there in Washington, D.C. in 1932, distinguished graduate, so it kind of goes against the view that Patton isn't a good student. Distinguished graduate is kind of culminating piece is on technology and communications and how this transforms warfare. And I think how he's different, he serves up at Fort Meade as the tank corps, He's different than his contemporaries because he's thinking combined arms, the three together, infantry, tanks, armor, and then artillery, as opposed to it's infantry supported by this other stuff. And that's what I think distinguishes him from many of his contemporaries in World War II even, that are still thinking on a kind of much more kind of staid piece where it's the infantry regiment and these guys support him. So you see him really as almost a risk taker in terms of going out on the limb on the technological applications, at least a thinker in an army that wasn't quite sure they wanted to embrace thinkers, I would argue.
And to your point, go back to the First World War, he is already thinking that armor must work with infantry. When he's in charge of the tank school, the American tank school in France in the First World War, and he writes a paper about this, and he emphasizes the fact that you have to have infantry and armor working together. He understands that you can't have one without the other. Now he's no zealot like tanks are the very future, because he's also realizes that Army politics in the way it is, you don't necessarily try to forego one branch over another. We all kind of work together, and there's some politics involved in that. And he doesn't want to shortchange the infantry because he knows that might stop him in his promotion and his way forward. But he's already looking, as Mike pointed out, this idea of combined arms. And he makes no bones about it in 1918 that infantry and armor must work together to seize these objectives, and that their roles are complementary to each other.
John, as you know, how is he wounded? He's wounded in combat, trying to make sure that the infantry stays up with the tanks as they attack in this process. And I think, he really embraces it to the point, here's the lesson that's really, burned into him, in France in that combat, that these are essential to work together. Even when they designed the patch, he's working with General Chaffee. Admiral Chaffee is kind of considered the father of the armor branch. They create a triangular patch, blue for the infantry, gold for the cavalry, and red for the artillery, because those three are kind of co-equal, as opposed to one branch is over the other. And I think that this kind of combined arms mentality is really a hallmark of his thinking, and that's kind of quietly influenced our doctrine since then, without really understanding how formative he is in some of the thinking.
And to that point too, he's also a big proponent of maneuver. The First World War, we see the static trench warfare, what goes on the Western Front, but these ideas of speed and mobility and movement and maneuver, which we know will become the norm in the Second World War. But a lot of nations, specifically the French, during the interwar years, don't see that as the wave of the future. They think firepower kills, static warfare is the way to go. And of course, the Germans embraced something a little bit different too in 1920 with Hans von Seeckt. And so he's already seeing that maneuver is the wave of the future. And he's fascinated with things mechanical. He likes cars. He likes to tinker. And as Mike pointed out, hey, how can I improve these Renault tanks? Maybe put some radios in them. He also wants like self-starters in them as well, and a couple other modifications he wants to make. And so he sees the role mechanization will play on the battlefield. Not like a Billy Mitchell. He's not going to get court-martialed for it, but he does see that this has a significant role in the wave of the future. And of course, the interwar years are chock-a-block full of discussions over what does mechanization mean? What does armor mean? What does combined arms mean? These terms aren't even necessarily formed or fully defined within doctrine. And of course, each nation has its own definition as to what that means as well.
Well, and you see, you take the maneuvers, Tennessee, Louisiana, Patton plays a major role. He's going to ultimately command 2nd Armored Division, but he's beloved by the media. The media is looking for a good guy. So you start to see a new branch of the Patton story early on, even before we enter the war. And then Patton, at the same time, is also about how is the general seen? How does the soldiers perceive him? Do the soldiers themselves feel distinctive? And with this idea that ultimately is decisive on a battlefield. And you start to see how he's shaping his image at the same time, I think, as the national media is looking for, some good news. America's just formed a kind of armor division. Who knows? Can we compete with these Axis folks who seem unstoppable? And I think that's where you see a kind of interesting kind of piece, because the Patton in the media is about the blood and guts Patton, not necessarily about the technical expert, the introspective leader that really is looking at some of those pieces.
And I think to your point about the public persona, you see in the First World War, he's already very, very interested in making sure his soldiers are shaved, that they're wearing the uniform correctly, that they're rendering salutes, all those things that are part of a military culture. That really starts in the First World War because what he's afraid that the Americans are perceived as non-professional, slovenly soldiers that aren't up to speed, and he definitely wants to address that. And of course, that also becomes part of his persona, as Mike pointed out, of this shiny brass, always sharp in appearance, and that carries on, of course, through the interwar years, and of course, as Mike pointed out, in the media, and this idea of his physical manifestation represents so much more than just him, but the entire United States Army. That's kind of how he saw it, and that's kind of where that genesis of this comes from.
The other piece, I think, even the distinctive uniform, he creates this kind of Green Hornet uniform, but even as a general officer, now he's got, he's kind of larger than life. He's got specially made kind of armor cavalry boots. They're wonderful. They have buckles rather than laces, so they don't get caught in the tank. Your uniform is kind of closely fitted. Of course, he uses the best tailors because he's from that part of society. And then he has his kind of signature pistols. He's got Colt 75 Peacemaker, which is he wanted a revolver because he'd had a discharge of his .45 pistol when he was a lieutenant. And so how do I not do that again? We can't have a general accidentally shoot himself in the leg or something like that. And then the other is a .357 Magnum, and they have he's got them special ivory handles and little crests. But this is about, if I really get in close quarters combat, I need something that's reliable and that can actually do the job. And I think that's part of his persona as well. That if I am in a fight, you can trust me because I can take care of myself in this fight.
One more thing on his personal aspirations. He's put in for a Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at the Meuse-Argonne, and initially he doesn't get it, and he's very upset about it. And he writes, back home that he isn't getting it. He finally gets it, and then he's kind of nonchalant about that he got it, but he definitely wanted that award. And so this idea of being recognized for his bravery or his audacity on the battlefield is very, very important to him. And he actually talks about, writing back home, about how he really wasn't scared. It's somewhat, I can't remember what he said, but it's almost like natural to him. And when he killed Pancho Villa's lieutenant, he says, it didn't bother me at all. He was like I was hunting an animal. It really didn't bother him. So again, you see this, he wants the adulation. He wants to be seen as a man of importance. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad trait for a young officer.
Let's talk about the battlefields of the Second World War that Patton will be involved with. And he's actually going to be involved in one of the very first battlefields the U.S. is engaged with in Europe, or in the European theater, we should say. And that's, of course, Operation Torch in North Africa. John, you've written extensively, including your most recent book, on amphibious assaults and amphibious operations. What's Patton's role in Operation Torch, and how does he do?
Yeah, he's in the landing force commander for the Western Task Force, which is going to land there in Morocco in November of 1942. And their goal is to get to Casablanca because it's got a major port. Because at this time, we haven't developed expeditionary kind of logistics operations, so the ports are really the goal. And so they're going to land 3 different landing forces, and they're going to converge on Casablanca. He is very skeptical of the Navy at this time. He doesn't think the Navy is going to land them, in the proper locations, and they kind of don't. But what you do see in that episode is he starts to establish a relationship with the Navy leadership, and he starts to gain some trust in the Navy, especially Admiral Kent Hewitt, who is the commander of the Amphibious Task Force. And they establish a very good relationship. And as a matter of fact, just to fast forward a little bit, 7th Army is born at sea before they land in Sicily, and so that speaks to this fact that he's recognizing that the Navy has something to offer here, especially now that the Army is doing amphibious assaults when the Army did not want to do amphibious assaults at all as late as July 1942, and now Patton has to do 3 amphibious assaults there as part of the Western Naval Task or the Western Task Force there. All the landings go relatively well. Of course, they're fighting the Vichy French, which is not really a unified force. They get ashore. There's lots of problems, but he's ultimately successful in that endeavor.
If I could jump in too, though, what's fascinating about the Casablanca piece is they're actually leaving from Virginia. This is an expeditionary operation through the North Atlantic, which this is still the Battle of the Atlantic going on. German submarines are still, they assume this is impossible, all the way into amphibious assault on the far end, and I think it's a display of American power. But here's a man who sees the possibilities, and really is the momentum is what's going to take you through this.
What is interesting though is before they even leave to go to Torch, Kent Hewitt is actually asking Patton, what are your priorities for lift? Because he has to load the ships appropriately. And the Army's slow to respond. He actually has to write a couple of very pointed letters to Patton and said, I need to know what you need to offload first, and your officers aren't here to tell me. But again, this is part of the learning curve that the U.S. has in the Second World War. And one of my major ideas now is that this is something the Americans do really, really well throughout the war is learn, develop, get better. And as a result, the Axis can keep up with what the Americans do in terms of new applications in warfare.
One thing that I think we don't often think about, though I think many of our listeners will probably know, as well-read folks on the Second World War, we're still years away from D-Day at this point. This is now 2 years effectively before. There's a bunch of stuff that's going to happen between Torch and D-Day, and a lot of it's going to involve Patton. So the next main event really is the invasion of Sicily.
Right. Here you are in July of 1943, and during this time, we're not ready to do the cross-channel invasion. We don't have the men or the troops, and we're still planning this thing out. But this is a democracy, and you got to keep the home fires interested in what's going on. And the Brits are still very much interested in owning the Mediterranean because to them, it's their lake. They own it. And it's the shortest route to get to the crown of the British Empire, which is the Indian theater. So they want the Suez Canal back. So what they do is they are able to get the Americans to participate in the Sicily campaign. However, at this time of the war, the Americans are still the little brother in an unequal relationship here. And Montgomery, who is going to land near Syracuse, and the Canadians at Pequeno are the main effort. And they're going to go up the East Coast and capture Messina and capture the German 15th Panzer Grenadier and Hormone-Goring Division. But the problem is something goes wrong on the way to the Forum, and the Brits get stuck at a place called Primasoli Bridge. Patton and the U.S. 7th Army's mission was to guard the British left flank. That puts him in a subordinate role. That's a role he doesn't like. And when he sees what's happening to the British forces and the Canadians in the eastern part of the island, he asks, unlike in the movie, he actually asks to push north and west to go up to Palermo. He asks for permission from Alexander, and he gets it. And what he does is he's able, getting back to Mike's earlier point, movement, maneuver, speed, and he uses that as a weapon and outflanked a lot of those German units. And then, of course, she pushes across that northern coast of Sicily and gets to Messina before Montgomery gets there. And just one side note, in the movie, they make it a big race. Patton's in a race. Montgomery's not. Patton is, but Monty's he's not that upset about it.
So let's talk, Italy is in some ways a great success for Patton. On the other hand, it represents a major professional setback for him because of something that happens along the way effectively that will then change the course of his career going into the D-Day invasions. What happened?
Sure. Of course, this is today we understand PTSD and not all scars are physical, and the mental toll that it takes on men. And we're on the cusp of that during 1943. We're not quite there yet. And he comes across a couple of soldiers, not just one in the movie, but there's a number of soldiers that he slaps, for cowardice. And, of course, he's admonished by Eisenhower. He's pilloried in the press. And even what's interesting about this is that his close relationship with John Pershing ends as a result of that. They never talk again after that event because he's so appalled by Patton's actions. And, of course, there are those who say, hey, Patton, you did the right thing by having a soldier straighten up. But, again, in retrospect, now we didn't understand these kinds of things. But that puts him, as he referred to it in the doghouse in the movie, if you remember. I'm in this upholstered doghouse while they're planning the invasion of Europe, But that doesn't mean he's out for the fight. And as you know, he has better things on the future.
The other piece with that is he's visited a number of troops, and he will, he meet with, the wounded soldiers or, put purple hearts on them, and he's crying and is really touched by it. And so it's not that he's insensitive, but here's a something that's outside of his kind of understanding, and I think that there's a side of Patton that, the movie doesn't show you. You don't see this very caring commander who is really deeply touched by the loss of his soldiers. I think some of the soldiers will experience that, and we see that's why, there's reverence for many of his troops later in the kind of Patton myth that comes from the soldiers as well. Let me hit one thing, if it still fits. One of the things I think we should think of Patton too, after the Western Task Force landings, as the Anglo-American force moves into, toward Tunisia, you have a huge setback with two corps, with Friedenthal, and they're going to task Patton to come take command of the corps. And what does he do before they go into combat after, I think, about 10 days? It's about discipline. We need to instill discipline, and then now we can be successful on the battlefield with that. And it's a trend that I think you see through his career in this, these kind of leadership principles. How do I restore a almost beaten organization into an effective fighting force and transform it? And I think, so you can see why he's a good pick for 7th Army going into Sicily, and why the people would respect him, despite, and we didn't talk, he's also, he loves kind of soldier talk. You've got to have, expletives there. It's kind of a show that he puts on for the soldiers as well, which for some of the press is fairly reprehensible. This isn't appropriate behavior and things like that. So there's a side of him that even the persona he's making is a bit of a caricature that causes trouble for him. I don't think he knows how to deal with the trouble he causes.
Interestingly, a man who sort of is made his reputation through the press, and also his reputation has suffered through his relations with the press. So sort of unique in that sense. I want to fast forward a little bit to the lead up to D-Day, because Patton's career is far from over, of course, at this point. He also is inhabiting a really unique role in the lead up to D-Day. Two questions. I mean, what's his role with Operation Fortitude? And secondly, how does he feel about it?
So Operation Fortitude, the huge deception effort, really to try to convince those 30-plus divisions, German divisions in Western Europe, that the main Anglo-American attack across the Channel will be at Calais. And how do we fix the mobile reserves there so that they don't influence, at least for a few days, the Normandy assault? And in some ways, this is a brilliant deception plan, because you think about what is your adversary assuming, and how do you take this? And you take, Patton's obviously the dashing commander. Of course, he'll lead the assault. So to put Patton there will actually really strengthen the deception plan, in my estimation. And really, the deception will last significantly longer than even we had hoped in that regard. And now Eisenhower, in his memoir says, he spoke with Patton about this role, but also, George, should we consider you for, Army Group Command? And Patton said, no, I want to be an Army commander. I want to command an Army. That's the level I want to be at. I don't know if that conversation happened, but it fits well, because then, this first U.S. Army group, the fictitious one, has served its role. Then Patton will then, as the head of 3rd Army, will push into Normandy as part of the Normandy campaign, and continue mission then. So he's kind of given a reprieve. He does have a guffaw, if you will, with the media, while he's the FUSAC commander. He talks about, the American and the British will kind of rule the world after the war, and this was supposed to be a private conversation. And so again, he doesn't, sometimes is indiscreet with the media, and the media isn't always helpful to him in the same process. And so I think you'll see that same gap when he's in Bavaria and places like that later, a similar tone, where he hasn't yet mastered that piece.
Along the same lines, I think his persona, again, is a weapon, as Mike pointed out. You put him in charge of a First Army group there, and that in itself, deception itself is a weapon. Even though you may not use it, but if the enemy thinks you are, that works. And for example, you fast forward to Desert Shield, Desert Storm. 5th Marines were never going to go ashore on Kuwaiti Naval Base, but Saddam Hussein thought they were, and that allows the Army to do the big left hook. And so, again, he's an enabler in that regard to allow Normandy to occur the way it does.
In that way, his oversized image, adds to this kind of deception piece, because they can track him. We know where he is, as opposed to, where are some of these other generals that are a little more out of the public image, if you will.
And even Napoleon would use that, his troops would, vive l'empereur, and he wasn't even around, but the other armies thought that he was. And that is a force multiplier in and of itself. So we're using the same kind of application, but in a modern parlance.
So Patton eventually does go ashore. He becomes commander of Patton's Third Army, as we were saying earlier, which really tees up one of the most dramatic moments of the latter phases of the war, and that's the Battle of the Bulge. And of course, Patton will play an absolutely critical role in the Bulge, a role that is still debated by historians, but certainly dramatized in the 1970 film. What happens here, Mike?
Yeah, so Patton takes command. They break out. They clear the coast of Brittany. Don't want submarine bases there. Race across France, south of Paris. Cross the Meuse by Nancy. Of course, they have to fend off the 5th Panzer Army attack, which never gets any press. It's amazing, the whole Air Corps tank battles in September, because everyone's focused on Bridge Too Far. Patton will push forward to the kind of borders of Germany, and they're poised to go right into the Saarland in the major attack. And then, the German counterattack, Wacht am Rhein is 16 December. Patton is one of the leaders, I believe, that senses this is something more than a local attack. Certainly Eisenhower does too. And then starts to reorient his forces that, instead of attacking into Germany, we're going to attack north into what it looks like the flank of German penetration. And then has forces, that moving before it's clear exactly what their objectives are. Will it be Bastogne? Where will it go? Of course, the terrain in the Ardennes is pretty restrictive. You're tied to road junctions and that piece and that. But this will be the largest campaign battle the Army has ever fought, the American Army. So 610,000 troops, and so Patton's large role in this, ultimately the relief of Bastogne, the elimination of the Bulge, will really kind of cement the soldiers' views about Third Army, can do these incredible things, can really pivot, have a decisive impact. And I think despite the absolute conditions that are terrible in the Bulge, you see how those veterans are really proud to have been part of that action. And I think even some, Fourth Armored Division will lead the effort to break through to Bastogne. There's times when Patton kind of treats them kind of difficult ways, like with the Hammelburg raid. But they still adore Patton, despite that, So they understand his kind of warts, but they adore that this is a commander committed to winning and have a decisive impact.
Well, and to that point, you mentioned it, he crosses the Rhine before varsity. The Brits have this intricate plan to cross the Rhine and get into Germany proper, and Patton beats him by like 24, 48 hours. He's already across? Who told him to do that? He just kind of did it on his own, and it talks about this idea of innovation and speed and mobility, and he's already doing that. And Monty's a little bit upset. They took some of his thunder.
It's an interesting piece because it's about how speed and momentum create new conditions as opposed to how do I master these conditions. And I think you see a real contrast, in how this is fought. And the whole exploitation and then the Central European campaign, into, Bavaria, Czechoslovakia. It's incredible how far and fast the Third Army is moving.
And to your point, logistics to support that. He's concerned about that in the First War with tanks and the limitations of fuel and mechanization and things break down. But then to push that far with these thirsty beasts called M4s, and still maintain those lines of logistics and support that speaks a lot to the detailed planning that goes into modern combined arms integration.
So the Battle of the Bulge is won. Patton's Third Army is advancing deep into Europe very quickly, as you've both mentioned. In early April of 1945, Patton comes across a horrifying sight at the end of the war that really, I think, speaks to his personal emotions that you were mentioning earlier, Mike. That this is a man who has this sort of public persona, but also has these moments of deep humanity in some ways. And of course, the incident I'm referring to is the liberation of Ohrdruf, which is one of the feeder labor camps into the German concentration camp system, which was actually hundreds of camps. Take us through what happens at Ohrdruf and Patton's role in all this.
Yeah, so, Fourth Armored Division, will seize Ohrdruf. It'll be the first camp that's liberated by the Americans early April. Previously, we'd seen Hadamar with the T4 program, but now this is the first concentration camp that we've uncovered. In a few days, it starts to make the press, amazingly. back in the States. I mean, there hadn't been a lot of understanding of what these camps were. But Eisenhower's going to go to Ohrdruf on the 12th of April, 1945. And early that morning, he's with Patton. First thing they do is they go to the Merkers mine, where there's huge looted gold, art. You see this kind of hidden Germany. What else is going on that we didn't know about? We feature that in the Monuments Men here. And then they go to Ohrdruf, and we'll go through the whole camp, the crematorium, the torture areas. Here's the bodies that are still there. And Patton's aide says, he's unable to continue. He actually breaks down, is crying as he sees all the humanity there. And so it's another side of him that's not the image he cultivates, but it's a separate one. And then, Ohrdruf, unfortunately, then they thought, maybe this is a unique camp. And then very quickly, there's camp after camp after camp that are uncovered. As you mentioned, there's hundreds of camps and sub-camps, slave labor facilities. And so you see this kind of crescendo with Ohrdruf. And I think it brings to light, though, this other Patton that we usually don't think about. You don't see him in the movie. You don't think about him, but his inner staff sees him that way. It's really touching.
So first week of May 1945, the war comes to an end in Europe. Adolf Hitler has committed suicide. The remaining German military surrenders, which is actually a more complicated process than we often remember. It takes place over a period of time. What does Patton want to do at the end of the war, John? What are his, he's learned a great deal from the First World War, presumably a lot from the Second World War, won't live to really do much, unfortunately, at the end of the war.
There's that great, part in the movie we're talking about defeating the Russians, why we still got the army here to do it, and push into, Eastern Europe. And I know in some of the tours that I've given here for the museum, I've been asked that question a number of times, whether or not that was a good idea. And my answer is a resounding no. It's a bad idea for so many reasons. First of all, just as I mentioned with the logistics piece of it, we're already stretched thin. By the time, we get to the Elbe, those logistic lines are already at the breaking point. And going beyond the Elbe, going into Berlin, that is very difficult terrain for armored forces to cover that area. And then the idea of marching into Eastern Europe? It didn't work out for the two guys that did it previously.
One of them only a few years before.
Yeah, that's right. Why would it work out any better for us? Not to mention the fact that most Americans have one goal in 1945, if you're a soldier, to go home. And nobody has a stomach for that.
So why does Patton think this? What influences the view that the Soviets are the next inevitable war?
Yeah. Well, again, his love of the Soviet Union is slim to none. He understands what that army has done. He understands that culture. He understands the threat that Bolshevism has, to the world in general. And so he's very much a man of his time in that regard. Fortunately, that we don't have that war. It's manifested in other ways 80, 90 years later. But I think he's interested in solving that problem. And it's a problem that, quite frankly, the Americans aren't interested in solving. Churchill, I would think, is back to Mike's early discussion, Churchill's very interested in that issue as early as 42 and 43, but the Americans are not. And so this idea of pushing east is just a bad idea.
If I could, this is while, Patton's become the military governor of Bavaria. And I think this is, one, that's not necessarily a role he would cherish. He wants to be the combat field commander, not the military governor. And, so he has all these challenges that you face, indiscretion, particularly with the media. He has the other challenge of how do you run a bureaucracy if everyone was a Nazi? There's certainly plenty, around. And one of his challenges is he says, well, we almost have to put denazification on a back burner because we need, to have the government running and functioning, which, of course, when it gets in the media, he's not able to manage that kind of that indiscretion, if you will, as it goes out. Now, he does, he does intervene to kind of save some Lippes honor stallions, which I think goes back to his cavalry heritage. But, so there's some interesting pieces there. He's always this man of action, as opposed to the bureaucrat. And I think
to your point, I think there might be a little bit of an internal struggle. Okay, now what? I'm at the top of my game. I'm 4 stars. A war just got over. What do I do now? I think he might have been kind of, I don't say midlife crisis. That's a little too strong, but.
Well, you just commanded the arguably one of the most effective combined arms teams of the Second World War, Third Army, it's interesting. We also leave out, sometimes we think about it, the era aspect. They've experimented. The battalions would have a battalion S3 air, the operations officer, but there would be an air guy. And in many of them, they'll have, an Army Air Forces officer, in the tank talking to pilots, on the ground. And so you see this kind of constant innovation and adaptation. How do we become faster, more lethal? How do we get technology and communications together to have this impact? And I could see in some ways he's kind of a letdown. The adrenaline's over. The war's done. Here I am in Bavaria. They send him out for the lone drive. Gets to go back to the States and do some parades. Of course, has the image, but I don't think he's really embraced this idea that I'm the military governor, and takes probably a cue from Lucius Clay, the overall military governor. This isn't a job for soldiers. This is a job for diplomats, and kind of the view of the Army at the time. I'm kind of stuck here. I'm waiting for the diplomats to take over.
For a man who had faced so much personal danger throughout his life, the end of Patton's life is somewhat surprising to a lot of people. Take us through what happens here.
Well, it's a traffic accident, and there's all kinds of conspiracy theories that they killed him because of his feelings towards the Russians and those kinds of things. But what people don't realize is those months and weeks after the end of the war, it's still a dangerous place to be. If you just look at that episode of the Last Band of Brothers, guys are still getting killed. There's still lots of detritus around of the war and bombs, and it's a horrible place to be. And so, it's not necessarily safe just because the war itself is over. And him getting involved in a traffic accident, well, the fact that infrastructure is broken and the fact that society is still broken down in Germany, it doesn't surprise me that there's something as simple as a traffic accident that brings him to his demise. Now, he lives for a few days after he gets hit, put him in the hospital, and then he succumbs to his injuries later on. But I think it speaks to the fact that just because the war is over doesn't mean the danger's over.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, you have even the potential werewolf movement. You see a couple bombs in Nuremberg, but you have all types of mines, poor infrastructure, and then military vehicles with tired dudes driving them. Is it likely they're going to make a mistake and ram into the vehicle in front of you when it stops? Not completely surprising. It's sad. And then he'll be paralyzed, and is in the hospital there in Heidelberg. If my daughter's listening, he died just down the hall from where you were born, there in Heidelberg. So in the military hospital.
So Patton dies in December of 1945, and he's not buried in Arlington, which is an interesting decision. Who makes that decision and why? I
believe the family makes the decision for him to stay there in Belgium because he's with his troops. If you go to the cemetery, he's at the very front. He's not in the middle of the cemetery itself, but he's still up front. And like every other soldier, it's just a plain white cross, but he does have his 4 stars on there. But it's not a grandiose marker. It's no different than any others, except for there's 4 yellow stars on it.
Which in many ways you think that's how he'd want to be remembered. I'm leading my soldiers. I'm in the front. I'm facing the same dangers they did. I'm buried with them. What more could you ask for as a commander to be with your troops for eternity? And I think it's pretty fitting in kind of Patton's view. I think the family captures that pretty amazingly. That's a powerful cemetery, there in Luxembourg.
Patton is truly beloved by so many of his men, beloved by the American public at the time. One reason why he's so well remembered, I think, today, 86 years after his death, is the 1970 film. So I have to ask you both, what do you think of the film? How accurate is it? Do you recommend it?
Accuracy, poor. However, I think it captures certain chapters and certain aspects of the man's personality. I think it's instructive in that regard. But as far as its, historical accuracy, like most movies, you take it with a grain of salt. The Germans didn't use Patton tanks, and those were Spanish troops. Those kinds of things that drive military historians crazy when they see that. But you understand that production is what it is. I do think people should view it to get an understanding of the man and his time. But like I said, with most movies, just take it with a huge grain of salt.
Yeah, I would second that. I think in terms of his leadership tenets, what he believed. Discipline, leadership from the front, how do I inspire people? How do we get them to do these amazing things? I think the movie captures that pretty well. His 1970 movie, it's pretty amazing that comes out during Vietnam. Academy Award winner. It's very powerful, and I think it taps into that aspect. And I think where it does a poor job, as John mentioned, is kind of the military aspects. They don't give Patton much credit for some of his operational military successes, which I think is unfortunate. You get a great image of the leadership of the man, but not his actual battlefield contributions. It's more like he blunders through it because he's real aggressive. He just happened to succeed.
Yeah.
Now, I would attribute a lot of that to the film's military advisor, which was General of the Army Omar Bradley. And so Bradley comes out of the movie looking, quite adult, very reasoned. He's behind this and restrains Patton. And I think it's unfortunate. It's turned out that way, but still pretty stirring. I think the iconic scene of Patton in front of the American flag, it's kind of a hodgepodge of talks he'd give, but it captures, his deliberate, even his language that he would use to kind of get with the troops and how this has resonated. There's even been, Muppets have had, figure in front of the flag and all these others. And I think there's subtle ways that Patton image of a leader has crept out, even if we could, excise some of his salty language and, try to ameliorate, better educate him not to, how does he treat soldiers in extremis. Here's some other lessons that we can take from it. And I think we saw that, certainly kind of stride out there. If you look at the Army's leadership field manual, Patton is the leader that is identified the most in the vignettes of any other. And I think some of that, it comes from his achievement. But I think the film, because it amplifies some of those leadership tenets, adds to that as well.
Mike Bell and John Curatola, thanks so much for being here and talking Patton with us.
Happy to be here.
Well, thanks, Bradley. It was a great discussion, and look forward to future ones.
George S. Patton was controversial, beloved by many, feared by others, and a leader whose legacy is still debated to the present day. But no matter how much you think you know about this icon of 20th century U.S. military history, there's seemingly always something else to learn. And the National World War II Museum here in New Orleans has the perfect way for you to do so. Registration is open now for our March 13 and 14 symposium entitled Patton, Man of War. We'd love for you to join us here in New Orleans, but if you can't make it, you can register for free online. Sign up now at our website. We hope to see you here.